is I'm going to give you a little history lesson about what things were like before we started the war on drugs and what they're like today, and let you make your own decision whether you think this had made any sense. First, let me talk about, is this one on also? Let me talk about the war on drugs itself. I joined the New Jersey State Police in 1964. That picture in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of when I actually graduated that year. And all of those other pictures are pictures of me undercover. The one right underneath the graduation picture is more or less a picture of when I graduated from their narcotic bureau. Actually, that's one of the better pictures. I try and keep the bad ones off of there. We really did look a little strange back then. It was 1970 when I joined the Narcotic Bureau. That was the beginning of the war on drugs. The war on drugs was actually coined and created by Richard Milhouse Nixon in 1960, or in 1970, and it had nothing to do with drugs. The first time he mentioned it was 1968 when he was running for the presidency for the second time. And he thought this time it would really be nice if he could win. So he knew if he was a strong anti-crime guy, it'd give him a lot of votes, but boy, if he could be in charge of a war on drugs, how those votes would pour in. And he was right, of course. He was elected, and then in his first year in office, he got the U.S. Congress to pass massive funding bills, giving tremendous amounts of money to any police department willing to fight his war on drugs. Show you how big this thing was, this funding. When I joined the state police in 1964, we had 1,700 troopers. We had a 7-man narcotic unit. Always seemed perfectly adequate for the job we needed to do. And 6 years later, we had exactly those same numbers. That is until October of 1970, when I went into narcotics, when overnight we went from a 7-man unit to a 76-person narcotic bureau. We enlarged the size of an organization doing one police job by 11 times its size, and this was replicated in police departments across the United States. I'm sure you understand that when you increase the size of an organization doing one job by 11 times the size, you set up a great deal of expectation. And since police are judged mainly by the number of arrests they make, the expectation with us was that in the coming year, we would make at least 11 times more arrests for nonviolent drug offenses as we did the year before. Well, that was a hard job in 1970 for a couple of reasons. For one, we'd never fought a war on drugs before. We had not the slightest idea what we were doing out there. But the big reason was we really didn't have much of a drug problem in the United States in 1970. As a matter of fact, if you go back and you look at the statistics from that year, you will find that the likelihood of anybody dying as a result of the drug war was less than the likelihood of them dying from falling down the steps in their own house. It was less than the likelihood of them choking to death on their own food at dinner. But we started a war on drugs. That war has had a dismal, absolutely failing effect. Let me explain what I mean by that. If this current drug policy actually works, then 7 things should have happened. The drug supply in this country should decrease, and the purity level of the drugs on the street level that people are buying should decrease. And that should cause the prices of those drugs to increase. And those 3 things together should cause drug use overall to decrease, overdose deaths to decrease, drug prohibition murders to decrease, And finally, arrests for drug violations to decrease. Eventually, got them. Of course, none of that happened. Let me take these one at a time and explain to you what really happened. Number one, drug supply should decrease. Well, the easiest way we have to measure how many drugs are being supplied to this country is what the seizures of those drugs are like. When I started kicking doors and seizing drugs with or without a warrant in 1970, we didn't care much about warrants back then, and we don't care too much about them now. The largest drug seizures at the beginning of that war were measured in pounds. And if you get very many seizures of a whole pound of hard drugs, you got promoted. What do we measure them in today? Tons. 10 tons of heroin, one seizure in the United States. 20 tons of cocaine, one seizure in the United States. 186 tons of marijuana, one seizure in the United States. Well, now you would think that when we're seizing all those drugs, it would make a difference on the street, but it hasn't. It hasn't made any difference whatsoever. You would think the drug purity would have to decrease, say in heroin, because there wouldn't be enough heroin to go around. Actually, drug purity has increased. When I started buying heroin on the streets in 1970, street-level heroin was coming in at 1 1/2% pure. All the rest was cutting agent. So when you bought this little package of powder, only 1.5% of that was actually heroin. Today, according to DEA, street-level heroin is coming in at 60% pure. Folks, that's a problem 40 times greater than it was at the beginning of the war. Drug prices. Number 3, drug prices should increase, right? Again, according to DEA, the wholesale price for cocaine since the beginning of the war has dropped 60%. The wholesale price for heroin is down 70% since the beginning of the war. Number 4, drug use should decrease. DEA estimated that at the beginning of this war, we had about 4 million people in this country above the age of 12 who'd used an illegal drug. I went back and I factored that into the population, that possible population back then. That was 2% of that population. Today, DEA tells us we have 112 million people in this country above the age of 12 that's used an illegal drug. Folks, that is 46% of this population. A problem 23 times greater than it was at the beginning of the war. Let's talk about overdose deaths. They should decrease. And if there's any way you're going to judge the efficacy of a policy, it seems to me it should be, are we saving lives? From the beginning of the war until about 1979, we were experiencing 28 heroin overdose deaths per 100,000 heroin users. Today, we experience 141 of those deaths. 5-fold increase. Something's wrong here. We're going the wrong direction, folks. Number 6, drug prohibition murders should decrease. And you notice I say drug prohibition murders. I don't say drug murders. They're not drug murders. They're not murders that happen because someone got high and went out and killed someone. They're murders that happen because the people who control the market of the illegal drugs make so much money that it's worth killing each other to control that market. It's worth killing us cops charged with fighting this useless war to control that market. It's worth it to them to kill children caught in crossfire and drive-by shootings in order to kill that market. So these are not drug murders, they're drug prohibition murders. You know, when we had alcohol prohibition almost 100 years ago, 1920 to 1933, and we had the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and back then we called the massacre 7 people got killed. The people who were sent there to commit those murders, who worked for Al Capone, were not high on alcohol when they killed those people. This was not a drug murder. This was a drug prohibition murder. And the people down in Mexico that are killing thousands of people today, and when they talk about massacres, it's really massacres. 70, 80 people killed, lined up and shot down. Those people are not high on drugs. This is just the way you conduct business under laws of prohibition. In Mexico, new president down there, Felipe Calderón, took over at the beginning of 2007. And thanks to the urging of the U.S. government, he declared his own personal war on drugs. And as a result, in the next 4 years, 36,510 people died as a result of prohibition murders. And folks, that's bad enough, but when you start breaking this down by year and look at it, the first year that he declared that war, 2007, 4,000 murders. The second year, 6,000 murders. The third year, 9,000 murders. And the fourth year, 15,273 murders. What's it going to be this year? 30,000? 40,000? Venezuela, which has become one of the newest countries for transit of these drugs between South America and Europe, goes to Venezuela and then goes to Western Africa, and then up to Europe. They're experiencing even worse problems than Mexico. In the same amount of time, 52,000 drug prohibition murders. And these two can't even begin to compare with countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. Does anybody know what the rate per 100,000 population, the rate of murders is in the United States per 100,000 population?
4.
4. You got it. 4 per 100,000. In New York City, which is a pretty violent place, where I worked for 12 years undercover, it's 8. 8 per 100,000. In Guatemala, it is 108 per 100,000. And it's all because of the drugs moving through that country. Put this in context for you. You know, we just supposedly ended a war in Iraq, and the last year that we called it a war there, we killed 5,000 Iraqis. Doesn't even come close to what's dying. 7, arrests for drug violations should decrease if this is working, right? You got the guys. I mean, how many guys could be out there? Eventually, you got to get them all. Not so. Actually, before we started that war, in 1965, we were arresting about 65,000 people per year for non-violent drug offenses. Then when we increased the number of people, cops doing this by 11 times the size in 1970, it started growing. And by the year 2005, we were arresting 1.9 million people every year for non-violent drug offenses, just in this country alone. Think of what that means, folks. 1.9 million people. Who knows the population of the state of Massachusetts? What is it? Anybody? Well, it's a little over 6 million. That means in 3 years, we arrest the size of the population of this entire state. And what does this mean to people who get arrested? You know, we do everything we can possibly do to destroy their lives. First thing, until November of 2008, until we finally managed to fight through a marijuana decriminalization law in this state. Before that, we were like most of the other states, and if you were caught with so much as one marijuana cigarette, the first thing they would do is take away your driver's license. You could be caught with that marijuana cigarette in your bedroom, doesn't matter, you lost your driver's license. What's that mean for a young person, woman, man, maybe married, maybe has children, might be the breadwinner for that family? What's it mean for them to lose their driver's license? You know, out here in suburbs or in rural America, we don't have public transportation. If you don't have a car, you don't have a job. That's quite a fine. And if you're trying to get an education, of course, thanks to the 1998 Higher Education Act, if you get caught with a marijuana cigarette, you no longer get a grant or a loan to go to college. Another pretty severe fine for these things. But even if you sneak out of those two things, the stigma that is attached to having been arrested for a drug violation is so overwhelming, it's almost impossible to get a job. And when I started working at this stuff, I'll tell you something I'm certainly not proud of today. When I started working at this stuff, there weren't many drug dealers out there on the street. Explain, we didn't really have much of a problem. So because there weren't drug dealers out there, they targeted us against young people. Young people in college, like yourselves, or in high school, or in between. Small friendship groups of people, maybe 10 or 15 people in that friendship group. Because back then, the only place you could find real drug dealers was in the big cities, New York City, Newark, Philadelphia. I wasn't working in any of those cities, I was working in the suburbs. So we got targeted against these small groups. Come Friday night, somebody in the group would say, hey, you want to get high? Of course, if nobody said that, that was my job. And if anybody took us up on that offer, then one of the friends might go around to the others. A friend who had access to the family car or some other way to get to the city, go around to the others and say, hey, you want to get high tonight? And the first person might say, oh, actually, you know, I got a test Monday, I got to study, I'll pass this time. And the next person might say, yeah, while you're in there, give me a couple joints, will you? And the next person might say, hey, I just heard there's some good blotter acid out there. Give me a stamp, right? One hit of blotter acid. When they come around to me, I put my order in for the same tiny little bit of drugs. They jump off in their car, run to New York City, in an hour they were back with the drugs. And when they handed them out to their friends, when they got to me and handed me that drug, they became a big-time drug dealer. Because that's what we labeled them, and that is what stuck. And I would stay in this group until I got everybody in the group, which was very easy to do because these were not drug dealers. They weren't making money from this. These were young kids accommodating friends. They weren't even getting their gas money back. So the second time people wanted to get high in that group, you got somebody different that made the run. And the third time, somebody different made the run. And I'd stay till I got every one of them. And I might be working 10 of those groups at the same time in different cities. So about every 2 months, I would have maybe 100 people with this kind of charge on them. And we would swoop into their neighborhoods at 5 o'clock in the morning with 350 cops, kick down their doors and drag them out in chains. When we got them down to the police station, we would have already called the media. The reporters would be there with their cameras to take their pictures and destroy whatever credibility, respectability they had in their neighborhoods. And when we got them all lined up against that back wall, my boss would come out and say to all those reporters, "See that? We took 100 major drug dealers out of your community. This is the worst thing that's ever happened in this country. We need more money for more police. We need more money to buy better guns and cars and technology so that we can defeat this scourge of drugs in our country." And you know, those reporters would never even ask, well, how much drugs were they selling? Who were they selling to? All they wanted to know was, what kind of drugs you talking about? When they asked me that, I'd say, what kind of drugs? So I bought heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, PCP, LSD, marijuana. Of course, probably 95% of what I bought was marijuana. But the reporters went away and wrote stories that made each one of these people look like they had their own personal drugstore. And you know what happened to those folks? Every one of them went to prison for 7 years. Nearly 1,000 young folks, just like yourself, just starting out in the world, just getting their education, ended up in prison for 7 years as a direct result of what I did out there as one undercover agent. That's a lot of lives to destroy. We fought the war now for 40 years. We have spent, of your tax dollars, $1.5 trillion on this war. And every year we continue, it's another $70 billion down that same rat hole. What do we have to show for it? This is the cumulative amount of arrests from 1970 to today for non-violent drug offenses. 41 million and counting, folks. 41 million. I mean, this stuff is mind-boggling what we're doing here. That's a lot of money to spend, a lot of lives to waste. You'd think at least we would have some effect now with all that on reducing the rate of addiction in this country. Not so. 100 years ago, when drugs were completely legal, when anybody, even a child, could walk into their local grocery store, and if they had $4.85 in their pocket, they could buy an ounce of pure heroin. Back then, 1914, our government told us we have 1.3% of the population that's addicted to drugs. They said, we can't have that, we got to make these drugs illegal. So they passed the 1914 Harrison Anti-Drug Act, the first federal act that made opiates illegal. Had almost nothing to do with drugs, folks. It was a racist law, just like every other law that has been passed about drugs in this country, a racist law. And the race that we really wanted to get at back then was the Asians, the Chinese. You see, we had invited the Chinese to come to the United States to build our railroads, because that was a dangerous job. So many people dying doing that. Real Americans didn't want to do that. So we asked the Chinese to come and build them, and they did. And once those railroads were built, then the Chinese went and they settled out in, mainly in the San Francisco territories. And the real Americans said, oh, they're taking our jobs away. We got to get rid of these people. Well, we couldn't deport them because we invited them to the country. But if we had the right laws, we could certainly imprison them. We could make things so hard for them that they would voluntarily go back to their country. So we're quite sure that these were racist-based laws because the first law was actually passed in the San Francisco territories, and it simply said, no Chinaman shall possess opium. Pretty obvious who we were after, huh? Now, when it was passed on the federal level in 1914, they took the word Chinaman out, but they still knew it was doing the same thing because the vast majority, probably 99% of the people in this country who possessed opium were Chinese. So it got the same job. Then we made a lot of the other drugs illegal, and of course they were all based on racism also. 56 years after this, we're getting ready to start a war on these people. That was a big step. So our government said, we need something to hang our hat on, something to prove that this is necessary. And they went out and did a survey, and they discovered 1.3% of the population was addicted to drugs. They said, we can't have that. We've got to start a war. Now it's 40 years later, all that money spent, all those lives wasted. Today, our government tells us 1.3% of the population is addicted to drugs. This is the only stat that hasn't changed in 100 years. But you know, some very important statistics have changed, such as this. This is the clearance rates for major crimes in our country, and it's pretty dismal. Now, if that's the clearance rate for arrests, the opposite of that is unsolved crimes, right? 40% of all the murders in the United States, unsolved. 60% of all reported rapes and arsons in the United States, unsolved. 75% of reported robberies, unsolved. And 90% of home burglaries, unsolved. Let me point out to you that in 1963, before we had a war on drugs, our police were credited with solving 91% of the murders in this country. Today, we solve 61%. What happened? Did we suddenly become incompetent?
No.
We have far more police per capita than we had in 1963. They're better trained, better educated, better paid. They have technology at their disposal like it came from Star Wars. How could we be solving 1/3 less murders? Well, the 50,000 cops, judges, prosecutors, supporters at LEAP know why. It's because we spend so much of our police staff time and energy chasing around nonviolent drug offenders that we no longer have time for those police to protect us from violent predators, from child molesters, from things that really count. And we say, let us get back to doing what's important here. The job of law enforcement should protect you from me, should protect me from somebody else. It should not protect each adult human being from themselves. And it's when we are assigned that kind of job that corruption really rears its ugly head. I don't know if you've noticed, but in the last week or so, there's yet another scandal out in NYPD where 8 detectives got arrested down there, and people were taking the stand and saying, oh yeah, well, we used to call it salting, by the way. Now they call it flaking. But the detectives are admitting, yes, we planted drugs on people. Why did they do that? To make their quota. That's what they testified. We planted drugs on people so that we could arrest them to make our quota, because the police department has a quota of the number of arrests that the narcotics unit people have to make, and if they don't make that number of arrests, they get put back in uniform. They don't want to get back in uniform. So instead, they plant drugs on people. What are we coming to? We need an alternative policy. I felt so bad when I retired from the New Jersey State Police about my role in implementing this failed policy of the war on drugs, that I sat down with 4 other police officers and we created Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And the way we came to that decision, first we tried to figure out what should law enforcement really be interested in doing. When we boiled it down to the essence, we said, we should be interested in reducing 4 things: death, disease, crime, and addiction. And as you all know, all 4 of those categories are made infinitely worse by the war on drugs. So that definitely wasn't what we wanted. What we decided we do want is reflected in our name, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. We want to end drug prohibition just like we ended alcohol prohibition in 1933, because as law enforcers we understand that the day after we ended that terrible law, Al Capone and all these smuggling buddies were out of business. They were off our streets. They were no longer out there killing each other, cops or kids. There's only one way to remove that violence. You got to remove the profit motive. That ends the violence. How do you do that? You end drug prohibition, which means one thing. It means legalize drugs. Legalize all drugs. The more dangerous the drug, the more reason there is to legalize that drug. Because you can't control or regulate anything when it's illegal. The control of the drugs today are in the hands of the criminals. They tell us what drugs are going to be supplied to our community, what they're going to be caught with, how potent they're going to be, how much they're going to cost, where they're going to sell them, and what age group they're going to sell to. And when they decide, as they have decided, to sell heroin to 10-year-old kids on our playgrounds, by God, that's what's going to happen. We say, let's take our responsibility back. Let's legalize these things and regulate how they're going to be sold. Regulate them. Take them out of the hands of the young people. The young people who have told us, kids in high school for the last 30 years, that it's easier to buy illegal drugs than it is to buy beer and cigarettes. What do you think? Does that sound sensible to you?